Hey everyone, this is Matt from Island Press, and welcome to the April webinar. We're highlighting NACTO's Transit Street Design Guide today. We're fortunate to have a really great panel. We've got Dr. John Renne from Florida Atlantic University, who's moderating the discussion, and we're going to see presentations from Matthew Rowe from NACTO and from Bill Bryant from Seattle Department of Transportation. And we may even have a surprise guest, so please stay tuned for that. But first, I would like to, there we go. First, I want to call your attention to our co-sponsors. Many thanks to NACTO for helping us to put this all together. And of course, everyone at Strong Towns. It's been great working with the Strong Towns team, and if you're not a Strong Towns member, I suggest that you sign up right away. Also want to thank the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions at Florida Atlantic University, and of course the Transportation and Land Development Committee of the Transportation Research Board. Okay, so here's a look at the agenda for today. I'm going to introduce John Renne. John will introduce our special guest today, and after that we're going to hear some presentations from both Matthew and Bill. And then the three panelists are going to have a discussion about the transit guide and how it relates to some key and current topics. And this will be followed up by questions from you guys, from the audience. So feel free to submit questions via the GoToWebinar questions function. And also keep in mind that we're recording this webinar, so I'll send a link out to the recording within the next day or two. So if you've missed something, don't fret. You can catch it all in the recording. And very quickly, I do want to mention the Island Press Urban Resilience Project, or ERP as we call it sometimes. The project brings together leading thinkers in the field to create original content that gets shared on lots of different platforms and media outlets. So far we've had ERP content in The Guardian, Huffington Post, Grist, The Hill, lots of different places, so please check it out on social media. And if you have questions or if you'd like to contribute, you can send a note to the email address on the screen, and the Urban Resilience Project is done with in conjunction and with a lot of support from the Kresge Foundation and JPB Foundation, so thanks to them very much. And also, everyone on the call today can get a copy of the Transit Street Design Guide at a 20% discount by going to islandpress.org and using the promo code 2NACTO at checkout. I believe the Strong Towns members have a different promo code, so if any of the Strong Towns folks have questions, you should contact Jason Schaefer at Strong Towns, or you can feel free to send me a note and I will connect you. And also, and I don't know if I said the discount code 2NACTO, just in case. Also, our moderator today, Dr. John Renne, happens to be an Island Press author as well, so you can get his book, Transport Beyond Oil, for 20% off by using the promo code 5Transport. Okay, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce John Renne, who's our moderator today. We're very lucky to have him. Dr. Renne is the director of the Center for Urban and Environmental Solutions and associate professor in the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida Atlantic University. He's also an honorary research associate in the School of Geography and the Environment at Oxford University. And Dr. Renne is the founder of the TOD Group, a private development firm that specializes in transit-oriented development. His research focuses on transportation planning and policy for resilient, livable, and sustainable communities. Dr. Renne is an author and editor of Transit-Oriented Development, Making It Happen, and Transport Beyond Oil, Policy Choices for a Multimodal Future. He's also the chair of the Transportation and Land Development Committee of the Transportation Research Board. So with that, I would like to hand things over to Dr. Renne. So John, I think we should all hear you, so it's all yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. I just want to kind of take a moment to thank Island Press for organizing this webinar and for also partnership with NACTO and Strong Towns, along with the center that I'm directing at FAU and the Transportation Research Board as well. So we're very excited for this new publication. and for this conversation and presentation to unveil this. It is my distinct pleasure to announce and introduce a very special guest that we have on this webinar. Shalita Reynolds is the General Manager of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation and the President of NACTO. Shalita?
Thank you so much. So good morning, everyone. I think this is my first time as a surprise guest, so I hope you're all suitably surprised for a Wednesday morning in government, for what it's worth. And just want to say how excited we are at NACTO to see this community of folks strong and growing who want to convene and have conversations about the exciting trade-offs that we have on our streets. I manage the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, and a little known fact is that we run a transit service. We had over 26 million trips on our Dash and Commuter Express lines last year, and have a fleet of about 350 vehicles. And we're also in the midst of supporting a huge build-out of the county here of dedicated rail and subway construction. And I'm just looking out my window at our first protected bikeway with a floating transit boarding island. So for the city of Los Angeles, this is a really pivotal moment, and resources like this one are just critical for us. We adopted NACTO's Urban Bike Design Guide and Urban Street Design Guide last year as part of the city's mobility plan, which means that designers in the city actually use these guides when they're making design decisions, which is a big sea change. And this morning, I'm really proud to announce that the City of Los Angeles is endorsing the Transit Street Design Guide as well. We had folks participate in its development and can vouch for the fact that it inspired rigorous debate and good discussion, and what you see in this document really represents the very best thinking out there about how to bring together all of the modes on our streets, which can sometimes feel as though they are in stiff competition for scarce right-of-way. So getting that equation right and getting that balance right is really the key to getting our cities right. So I'm really excited to announce our endorsement this morning, and also hopefully kick off here in the coming days a campaign to get other cities and other transit agencies to join us in endorsing the guide. I also just want to underline that this year NACTO is opening up a new membership category for transit agencies. So if you work for a transit agency or in a city where you partner frequently with a transit agency, we're very excited and looking forward to the opportunity to bring those folks into the organization as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and without further ado, let you get underway with what is, I'm sure, going to be a really exciting webinar today. So thank you so much for giving me a couple minutes at the top just to share our excitement and how much we're looking forward to using this guide in our work.
Shalita, thank you so much. That is a very exciting announcement, and I'm actually sitting here with the Transit Street Design Guide in my hand. So for all you listeners, I highly recommend and endorse this book. It's a phenomenal resource. I'm actually already going to be using this in my classes with my students. It represents a whole new way of not just thinking about streets. Of course, that thinking has been occurring for a long time, but it represents new tools that we can use as planners and designers and engineers to be able to implement these exciting ideas. So I would like to turn it over to the man who's responsible for putting this together. Matthew Rowe is the director of the Designing Cities Initiative at NACTO, where he leads the organization's work with city professionals across North America and leading the development of the Transit Street Design Guide. At the New York City Department of Transportation, Matthew introduced evidence-based approach to the department's globally recognized street design programs, leading a safety planning and research team and helping to transform over 80 miles of major corridors into safe places to walk and bike. His academic publications focus on the relationship between street design and pedestrian safety. And as someone who is a native New Yorker, I can tell you that transforming 80 miles of New York City streets is no small feat. That probably ranks up there with the likes of folks like Robert Moses. So Matthew, welcome.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks very much, Salita, for that ringing endorsement. And I'm very pleased to hear both that the City of Los Angeles is endorsed and that the guide itself sparked discussion. And I hope that the endorsement process for cities does the same all across the country, all across North America. Now, John, I will say this: I'm no Robert Moses, but we'll have a great discussion here, and I hope to hear from all of those of you on the webinar and hear more about the questions that you have about transit after we talk about the guide and hear from the City of Seattle about some of their projects. So NACTO, for those of you who aren't familiar with us, the National Association of City Transportation Officials, we're a membership organization, 45 cities in North America, and we represent cities at the cutting edge of change on the street. Cities have been a site of innovation for a long time in street design and in transportation, and NACTO brings together these cities to create a powerful peer network. And as Salita has told me, with peer-to-peer learning, there is nothing we can't accomplish. NACTO's developed a series of design guides, starting with the Urban Bikeway Design Guide in 2011, continuing through the Urban Street Design Guide, which revolutionized the way that cities think about their streets, through to this year when we've released in short succession the Transit Street Design Guide and the Bike Share Station Siting Guide, and coming soon the Global Street Design Guide. So we're very pleased today to be able to talk about the Transit Street Design Guide and how it's poised to revolutionize the way that cities and transit agencies work together along with civic leaders to create great streets for transit. Why do transit streets matter? Why are we here? Why are we doing this? Partially it's about what passengers want, and partially it's about what operators want. So what do these two very different groups want, and then what does that mean for the city? Well, there's actually good research now on what passengers want. Transit Center, which helped support the development of the guide along with the Summit Foundation, did some great research just about a year and a half ago on mobility attitudes around the United States, and found very clearly both current and potential transit riders want some very simple things from transit. They want reliability, and they want convenience. They want competitive trip time. They want transit, in other words, to get them where they're going, and they want to be sure that it will get them where they're going. Secondarily, they want things like comfort, and they want a sense of permanence to their transit service. But those are not the main determinants of whether or not they ride transit. What really matters is, does it work? And by the way, is it affordable? What transit providers want is a little bit different and can vary a little bit, but there's a huge overlap between what riders want and need and what transit providers want and need, and that overlap is in reliability. It's all about making transit into a service that's viable to provide on city streets and that really supports urban growth. It's a city building tool, and that's what we're all about. Transit faces very specific design challenges, even in cities where there's already great transit service, even on streets where there's already a lot of on-street transit activity, and even when there's a lot of demand. We often face conditions where transit street design is an afterthought, even when there's frequent service already on a street, even when a lot of people are using it. So that's why street design matters. So we're going to talk about why these principles have been developed and how they come into play in cities. The Transit Street Design Guide draws from best practice and cutting-edge research from across the continent and around the world to promulgate this new set of principles for designing streets that'll support efficient, safe, and comfortable transit service for everybody. It's really not just about making the bus run faster, making on-street rail run faster, but about getting people to transit and using transit as a tool for city building. Better streets create better service. Investments in transit streets that organize and balance the users of a street can improve the streetscape and place transit in a priority position at any scale, from small neighborhood streets to significant capital reconstruction projects that place mass mobility front and center. Transit creates urban places. We're in a singular time of urban population growth and regeneration, both in the United States and around the world. Almost half of Americans say they want to live in walkable urban places, and about half of those already know that what walkable urban places mean is a big city neighborhood. But only about 2% of the homes in the United States are in a walkable, transit-connected place. We can do much, much better than that. And on-street transit, no less than our commitment to walkability, is going to be the measure of how we get there. Transit streets create the kind of place that people want to be and the kind of place that supports further transit service. And that's a positive feedback loop that we hope to trigger through street design. In some cities, planners and engineers, service planners, transit providers are completely reconsidering the role of their transit system within the whole transportation suite of the city, considering how transit functions in relation to more on-demand services, in relation to bicycle networks, in relation to walking, and in relation to the growth of the city overall and over time. This is the Houston new bus network. This is frequent service before the plan was executed in 2015, August 2015, and this is after. And the remarkable thing is that they did this without spending significantly more money on service, and provided the city with not just service to downtown, not just reliable service that would get people in and out of the core of the city, where there's still a very significant amount of employment, but where a lot of growth has been pretty far outside of it and had been pretty disconnected from transit. So not only getting to downtown, but getting to the entire city and getting to the densest neighborhoods, some of which didn't have any frequent transit routes at all. The results speak for themselves. Weekday bus ridership is up, and weekend bus ridership is substantially up as people have come to rely on transit not just for a more conventional 9-to-5 work trip, but for a wide variety of the trips they want to take. As cities grow denser, there's just no way to grow while relying on the automobile. There just isn't the space. We're not going to move everybody in cars who wants to be in a city, and they don't want to be moving in cars. And we certainly can't build kinds of underground and above-ground capital investments that have traditionally been the trunk lines of transit systems in the United States to meet that massive growth. We certainly can't do it quickly enough. But we can move people on the street in very large numbers if we take the leap to dedicate space to transit. It's far and away the most space-efficient travel mode, and therefore deserves the most investment on the street where people want to be. And whether users on the street are riding transit or not, everybody benefits from great transit, unlocking the street space and increasing connections to the rest of the city without pushing more and more cars onto the street. One of the benefits that transit has for a city is to create the possibility of safe movement at a large scale. Transit has a 50-to-1 advantage over cars for vehicle occupant safety, and the safest cities are transit cities. A recent study observed reductions in injuries and fatalities after implementation of BRT projects of 25 to up to 70% on corridors. So transit safety is really all about people walking, and pedestrian safety is closely tied to the access and completeness of the networks. And what this guide does is add to that mix how you create great streets for transit that are also great streets to walk and bike on, as this example from Chicago shows. Finally, transit projects not only move people into a safer mode, but provide a chance to remake the entire street. Cities are realizing the importance of planning growth around transit. The positive effects of transit investment on local business activity and regional competitiveness is well documented by now. But what's really important is to realize that it's not just the mode, it's the reliability and the permanence of the mode that matter. And so cities are expanding far beyond most tried and true methods that might be more popular with some or other groups of doing rail investment, of doing large-scale redevelopment, but really being able to use all the modes of transit as tactical ways and long-term ways of improving the local economic conditions and in providing permanent economic benefits in neighborhoods and in large redevelopments alike. So as transit enables better access to communities, ridership really reinforces its own permanence and sets off that virtuous upward spiral. Better ridership means more frequent service, and that means that we need to put things where transit is so that people can actually use transit to get to those things and create that simple yet vital upward growth in ridership. And that means that at every scale, at the neighborhood scale, the Transit Street Design Guide provides design packages that work on streets where the desire isn't for very fast movement, but for reliable movement, for keeping buses in their lane and not forcing them to get stuck behind queued cars. To busy corridors that move very large numbers of people in transit and in every mode, and providing an organized street that gives reliability and safety and comfort to every mode. To downtown settings where it's really all about public space and delivering people in large volumes as they get to their destinations. Downtown and destination streets can be linear public spaces, and that's critical to understanding the intention behind the guide. The NACTO Transit Street Design Guide is the product of work by 45 cities, 18 transit agencies that participated in the steering committee, agencies that operate everything from bus to light rail to streetcar and everything in between. This steering committee, along with the contributing committee from ITE, that's the Institute of Transportation Engineers, input from various federal agencies that work on both accessibility and on transit and on streets, ensure that the guide will be useful to both practitioners and to the public, all the way from the most technical users, signals engineers, to neighborhood leaders who really just want to make their own streets better. I'd like to make a special call out to the NACTO staff who worked extremely hard on putting this guide together, certainly not just me, but also Craig Tuchek and Aaron Villery, as well as Corinne Kisner. Craig and Aaron's work on graphics and illustrations and on production resulted in a gorgeous guide, and we couldn't have done it without Corinne's insight. The guide merges research and practice in a way that fundamentally builds upon the work that cities are doing all around the country. There's an example from San Francisco that we used to build the street design that you see in front of you, really combining some of the best of how you make use out of a small urban space. One of the advantages of working at the level of city government is that cities are right on the forefront of practice, often far ahead of research, but research has come a very long way in transit, and we've got a great body of work to draw on, and we were able to construct full-scale models of streets. These are our street typologies, which kind of form the core, the heart of the guide, together with more specific guidance recommendations, and built on and enhanced by detailed case studies that explain how these kinds of streets have been implemented in real life. So chapters of the guide: why transit streets matter, we've talked about that. What transit streets are, those are the typologies, stations and stops and elements, transit lanes and transit ways, and then intersections and signals and systemic strategies. The stations and stops section really explains how to go from stops to stations. That's a core principle for understanding how to create transit streets. Stations really create a sense of place, they create a sense of permanence, and they draw people to transit, they draw people to a street, make them feel like it's part of their street. And it's not always a matter of building large structures. Sometimes it can be as simple as providing shade trees that actually change the environment for people waiting for the bus. Sometimes it's as simple as explaining to people how to board a bus quickly. and providing ways to do that. There's guidance, detailed guidance on how to design transit lanes and transitways. We use transitways to mean any fully exclusive running way, whether it's for bus or for rail, and even some guidance on the kinds of materials that have worked well, whether it's scored concrete or permeable green running ways, or the simple means of separation that can keep everybody in the right lane on a street. Detailed guidance on intersection and signal design, helping everybody from engineers who haven't worked on transit before to general practitioners to planners who may have worked on transit but not with a specific type of vehicle, understand what some of the technical requirements are for designing intersections around transit. And then all the way up to systemic strategies. There's an example from San Francisco where universal all-door boarding, extending all-door boarding policies from what used to just be the rail system in Muni to all the Muni buses, reduced boarding time by 38% per person. When you save a second and a half per person across an entire city, you save minutes at every run. You can actually run more buses on a street, and that's what it's all about. If you create better service, you can create better streets. So where does the rubber meet the road? It's really all about tackling sources of delay for transit. Here's an example from New York City, where on Webster Avenue, the EX41 in the Bronx carries about 35,000 people a day, and those folks were spending almost half of their trip not moving. They're spending it stopped for other passengers. As you can see in that picture on the top, those queues get pretty long. They were spending it stopped at red lights. The signals weren't coordinated for transit, and then then they spent the other half of their trip actually going somewhere. So one of the interesting things is what that means is for those of us who don't work for transit agencies for a living, when you're a transit operator, you look at those numbers and you can say, wow, look at that. We're paying our operators and maintaining our buses for half of the cost of doing those things is actually spent not moving. So we have huge cost savings in addition to the savings of moving people. So there's effectively a double win from reducing the amount of time that buses, that transit on streets spend waiting. So reducing that by converting from mixed traffic flow to dedicated flow, to dedicated bus lanes, transform the way that bus line works and the way that people perceive it. Ridership is up. As a result, travel times are down. As we saw in the previous slide, it's all about tackling those sources of delay. For cities and for neighborhoods, that increased throughput, it's vital for growth, right? This is how you get growth without increased congestion. Faster boarding is assisted by in-lane stops. And you can put all these pieces together to create a fundamentally different kind of street. Everything from the details of pedestrian refuge islands, which improve pedestrian safety and also save signal time, allow pedestrians to spend less time crossing the street, make it possible to have shorter light cycles. It's a detail that transit agencies almost never control, that street departments do control. And it's something where working together, street and transit agencies can create significantly better conditions, often through very small interventions on a street. Organizing the street by designating lanes, including providing protected bike lanes, but possible to create high-quality conditions directly along the same corridors as a bus line. Allowing right-side lanes, for example, allow local and rapid service to share the same lane. Center running lanes can do that too with right-side islands. And there's a lot of creativity that and ingenuity that transit agencies and street departments have applied to creating great streets. We're going to hear a little bit more about that from Bill in just a few minutes. Finally, the station improves the whole image of the street and creates a sense of permanence, creates a very comfortable place to wait, and elevates transit as an experience from the experience of kind of waiting by the side of the street and maybe something will come for you into an experience more like what we associate conventionally with with fixed rail trunk line systems. But what's good for rail is often very good for bus as well. And dedicating phases or managing signal timing in a way that works for transit, often lowering the speed at which signals expect traffic to go, can actually make buses go faster, somewhat counterintuitively. Finally, it's all about measuring the whole street, from safety benefits to pedestrians to the public space benefits of dedicating space, to the economic benefits that flow from those things, and the overall health benefits from an improved walking, biking, active transportation environment. Transit is very much a form of active transportation, supporting those other modes and interplaying with them. And finally, how do you create mobility and access for not a few hundred people an hour, but for a few thousand people an hour? That's really something that can only be accomplished when you measure it and when you work toward it. We get what we measure for, and you can't manage what you can't measure. So it's all about fundamentally rethinking how we assess our streets. We hope that you join us at the Designing Cities Conference in Seattle in September later this year. It'll be a great event. Our previous one in Austin was extremely well attended. Before that in San Francisco. We've had a wonderful array of practitioners and leaders from around the country, around the world, come together to talk about the best in street design. And I think we already got a plug, but one last thing. We just launched our website for the Transit Street Design Guide, so check it out, nacto.org/TSDG. And of course, go to Island Press and order the guide. Thanks, John.
Thank you so much, Matthew. That was a great presentation, and your images were really, really well done in your presentation. So I just want to compliment you on that. Really helped to really highlight what you were saying. I myself recently moved from New Orleans to Florida, where we have some really awful streets, but I am a daily transit user and bicyclist to commute to work. And I have to say, in watching your presentation, it makes me really excited to know that this stuff is going to have a major impact in the performance of transit systems and the safety of streets. Not just for places, like New York City, but, as this new guidance comes out, it really can make a big difference in Sunbelt cities like where I'm located. So it's very exciting. And one of the leaders in doing this kind of work for many, many decades now has been Seattle, Washington. Bill Bryant is the Seattle Department of Transportation Transit Manager. SDOT's transit program includes funding for approximately 300,000 hours of transit service annually, as well as more than $140 million in local funding for capital projects from 2008 through 2025. Since 1998, Bill has been responsible for managing many transit service and capital projects, ranging from tiny up to full transit corridors, including large pieces of transit operator King County Metro's successful Rapid Ride BRT program. Bill previously served in various transit planning capacities at King County Metro, including planning for BRT, light rail, and monorail station access, and integration of higher capacity transit into the bus network. Bill, welcome.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much. I just want to really quickly also thank Salita Reynolds and Matthew Rowe and the rest of the team at NACTO that have produced this incredibly exciting Transit Street Design Guide. That was a great effort, and I really want to encourage agencies, planners of all stripes, private practice planners, and engineers to buy a copy. It's a beautiful book. So my presentation is going to talk about Seattle. I'll give some brief background on the city of Seattle and the rapid growth that we're seeing right now. Then I'll talk about some specific bus stop, bus lanes, and transit signal treatments. And then I'm going to go into a little more detail about our featured project, which is a recently completed transit corridor extension in the fast-growing South Lake Union neighborhood on Westlake Avenue, and then just briefly about some of the successes that we've seen with the Rapid Ride program. SDOT's mission is to deliver a high-quality transportation system for Seattle. We are committed to core values, including creating a city that's safe, interconnected, affordable, vibrant, and office buildings with parking for several hundred cars. 700 is a figure that's common for some of the larger towers, the 40-story towers. And we as a city have essentially made a policy decision that growth needs to be accommodated through ways other than SOVs. So as Matthew said, there's just simply no more space, and improving transit and transit capacity and the attractiveness of transit and the effectiveness of transit is just absolutely essential in cities like Seattle. Seattle is somewhat typical of large cities in that a huge percentage of our land area is in public rights-of-way, mostly street space. Our typical arterials are 60 to 66 feet. We do rank high in walkability and in bicycle commuting, and we have a strong growth management plan. As I mentioned, we're up to about 680,000 people. That's 8,100 per square mile, and we have a very small household size of just over 2. The map at the right here shows in the blue is what we call the center city area of Seattle, with a population of nearly 200,000, or job base of nearly 200,000. And then on the right you see the eastern area of King County, including some fine dense cities, Bellevue and Redmond, but the space required to house that roughly 200,000 jobs is far more vast. We have an excellent transit mode split in downtown Seattle of 45%. It's actually grown since then, and the drive-alone rate has come down from 31 to 29%. It's not so good once you get outside of the immediate center city, but we do have several other close-in employment centers with transit mode shares in the 30% range. This graphic is almost needed to really deliver the message of the importance of putting and the efficiency of putting people on transit and in alternative modes. The space taken up by the number of cars is just really striking compared to that of the bus, light rail, or bicycle pictures. So we need to efficiently accommodate multiple modes. We do have strong policy guidance on transit here in Seattle. We have a city transit master plan that was approved in 2012 and amended this year. It gives us both capital and service investment guidance for transit. So I'll talk about bus stops a little bit. On the left, and I think Matthew's great presentation might have actually included that same picture on the left, or a very similar one. But on the left we have a transit island with a one-way protected bike lane behind the transit island. And then on the right we have a more traditional bus bulb. Both of these are very effective ways of creating in-lane bus stops. So the last thing a bus needs to do is wait for general purpose low occupancy traffic to pass before re-entering traffic at a bus stop. Islands and bulbs help organize the roadway and actually add to the public realm and add to the space that is not dedicated to single occupancy vehicles. This is a before and after of a project in the Belltown neighborhood of Seattle. Before, you can see that the roof of the transit shelter is just a couple feet from the curb line. And then in the after photo, we've added something like 6 or 7 feet of sidewalk width to this stop, creating an in-lane bus stop, creating a much more easily accessible pedestrian pathway for businesses and residents to the right of the transit facilities, the bus shelters, and generally upgraded the urban streetscape in this location while creating an in-lane stop and adding pretty dramatically to the quality of the transit passenger facilities. This is another shot of a similar project. It's a little different project, but it's in the same area, the dense Belltown area of Seattle. We always include amenities. Matthew mentioned the success that San Francisco has seen with off-board fare payment. In Seattle and in King County, King County Metro has included in their rapid ride bus rapid transit program off-board fare payment at most stops. The City of Seattle and King County Metro have very strong partnerships across the board. We don't always agree, but we have had a great record of success in jointly implementing these projects. So on the left you see a transit information kiosk that also includes an ORCA reader. SDOT owns the kiosk and King County Metro owns the ORCA reader. The ORCA reader, the ORCA is our smart card system here, and that's integral to the off-board fare payment system that we use. On the right we have some in the upper right is an example of real-time schedule information, a different type of real-time schedule information using LED signs. This shows a two-way protected bike lane behind a shared bus and streetcar stop in Seattle's First Hill neighborhood, recently completed. Off-board fare payment I spoke about briefly, but we actually locally designed and had fabricated these transit information kiosks. They're really essential to keeping transit moving on 3rd Avenue, which is our main transit spine, with over 200 buses per hour per direction during the peak hours. On the left you see a very low-cost storefront real-time schedule information LCD screen. The cost of that can be as low as just a couple $1,000s, barely more than the cost of the TV screen and a small limited use CPU. This is a very early shot of one of the rapid ride lines in Seattle, the E line up on Aurora Avenue North. This shows sort of the suite of bus stop improvements where it's a very, very challenging environment, highway dominated. It's a state route highway, and still the rapid ride program has added significantly to a pretty compromised streetscape. Another example of real-time schedule information. So in Seattle, when we do bus stop projects, we tend to try to group those projects, and there's no better time to consolidate bus stops, to rationalize the distance between bus stops. Our policy support is for approximately a quarter mile between bus stops. We have some other guidelines. For example, if there's just a single lane of travel, we're unlikely to build a far side in-lane bus stop at a signalized intersection. The signal is a proxy for significant amounts of cross traffic, and so we don't want to block cross traffic. But at the same time, it's very easy to do this when you have multiple travel lanes per direction. We have included in our city right-of-way improvement manual guidance that does require in-lane bus stops at most locations. And then there are bus lanes. There are many, many ways to do bus lanes. In Seattle, we tend to use what we call a business access and transit treatment, which is not an exclusive bus lane. It does allow vehicles to use the curb running or the outside bat lane for turning onto and off of the street, but these cars, other vehicles are required to turn at intersections. Sometimes there's a parking lane adjacent to the bus lane. As far as pulling all these pieces together, as Matthew mentioned, you combine bus lane treatments with other treatments, including signal treatments, queue jumps, transit signal priority, bus bulbs, bus islands, and other tools, and that's how you really get the effective package. This is just a typical cross-section showing outside bus lanes on a very wide street. The lane widths for the transit lanes are typically 11 to 13 feet. This is a before and after shot of that sort of street configuration where the outside lane has been converted to a bat lane. This is another example of a different cross-section with essentially a 4-lane cross-section with parking on one side. This is the photograph. And even a one-way street with a single lane of travel, the City of Seattle had a project to limit non-transit traffic by requiring turns at each cross street. This is Bell Street in downtown Seattle. And then the red treatment or other high-profile sorts of visual treatments have been very successful here in improving compliance. And I'm happy to provide details on any of this actually to any member cities or any interested party. So I won't go into the specifics of the materials on this or the design, but it's not cheap, but it has been highly effective, and it certainly raises the profile of transit in the public mind. There's just a picture of a Seattle crew installing a red bus lane. Then signal treatments, and this photograph, I have to say, is getting very, very tired. I'm pledging to retire it after this presentation, but it does show a signal queue jump, a traditional signal queue jump where the bus has a green light that you can barely see circled on the right, allowing it to jump in front of other traffic. This could be considered a form of transit signal priority. There's nothing other than traditional loop detection, so the signal doesn't know for sure that it's a bus, although there are ways to place the signal detection to give the signal a pretty good idea that it's a bus. But in a transit-only lane, it's generally been very successful using this relatively low-tech solution. When you apply these tools, these signal tools along the length of a corridor, you can easily achieve travel time savings in the 10% range, including signal priority, and up to 20%. It just really varies widely by other factors such as overall traffic volumes, transit volumes, boarding activity, etc. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about this Westlake Transit Improvement Project, which includes some innovative treatments, such as a center running bus lane with new for Seattle at least, signal treatments. This project was given the go-ahead in February of 2015 and was completely installed by March of 2016. The Westlake corridor is about, the overall project is about a mile long. The Westlake portion of it is about 3/4 of a mile. And the project included extending several bus stops and shared bus and streetcar stops to accommodate more transit vehicles. There was a significant service increase scheduled for March, and so our goal was to have the project completed by that time. The overall cost was $1.7 million for that entire length. That included several bus stop upgrades, several signal upgrades, and restriping the entire corridor. The lane widths did not change. The lane widths are generally range actually the transit lanes from 10 to 13 feet, with mostly those being in the 11 to 12 foot range, and the overall corridor, the width of the roadway curb to curb is 58 feet for most of the corridor. Some of the elements include a traditional transit lane for the entire length of the corridor. This is where right turns are permitted, as you can see from the signage. This picture also includes one of the shared bus streetcar stops that was extended. We're looking north here. The South Lake Union neighborhood, I should say, is home to Amazon.com. It's growing incredibly rapidly, and we are struggling to stay ahead of that growth, and this kind of project is going to be the only way that we'll be able to stay ahead of that growth and to provide the transit capacity that's needed. So this street now has approximately 25, a little fewer than 25 transit trips per peak hour in the peak direction. Sort of a bidirectional peak street, actually, so the volumes are fairly consistent in each direction. The south end of the corridor has as few as perhaps 6,000 daily vehicle trips, ramping up to almost 30,000 at the north end of the corridor. This is another piece of the project that shows one of the shared bus streetcar stops, far side, you can see in the distance that was extended by the project. Let's see, this shot also shows a signal treatment that we added. You can see, I can't see it, my screen is partly blocked, but this is a location where it's a cross street, it's a major cross street, and cars turning right, actually that's this location, cars turning right would wait for pedestrians. There's a great deal of pedestrian activity at this location, Westlake and Denny Way. And so the project added a right turn arrow and a lagging pedestrian phase so that cars in front of the transit vehicle, the view here is as if it's from the windshield of a transit vehicle. There are often cars in front of that vehicle. This new signal treatment allows the cars to clear out and the transit vehicle to move forward at the same time as the pedestrians move forward. It took about 4 days of getting used to, very bad compliance for the first couple days, and people quickly got the idea. This is looking like a highly successful element of this project. This shows, this is also going northbound. This shows a transit-only segment, so there are no vehicles other than transit allowed in the right-hand lane, no right turns, no left turns from the transit lane. The project added the pylons, the white pylons that you can see to prevent cars from cheating and turning right across the transit lane. This is also a signal queue jump location where buses jump into a center running bus lane right here. This is looking the opposite direction. So the bus leaving the location that we were just looking at would come into this center running transit only lane after about a half a block of mixed traffic where the white car in the rear is located. The bus will then encounter at the end of that transit lane, the center running transit lane is just a couple blocks, but it's a couple key blocks to get around queues of vehicles headed for the freeway. So this shows a bus leaving the end of that center running lane, and it shows the rail style lunar white bar signal. You can see a transit only signal. There were many turn restrictions as part of this project. This had formerly been a left turn lane for general purpose vehicles, and it's now a transit only lane. The project also included transit layover at the end of the line for 4 vehicles. This is part of the project that you could not claim adds to the streetscape, but the Westlake Avenue part of this project really did pull it all together. Besides literally physically adding to the sidewalk space by thousands of square feet of new sidewalk, it also, by creating the transit lanes, really makes the pedestrian environment more pleasant. You have a buffer. Having a transit lane next to the sidewalk is not like having a traffic lane. It's much more predictable traffic, it's much lower volumes, and it just is part of pulling it all together. And here we have many happy bus customers boarding the King County Metro Rapid Ride line. This is another piece of pulling it all together. This is the branding of King County Metro's Rapid Ride system. The Rapid Ride lines combine all of the elements that we've just discussed, and the result is that in many cases, in virtually every case, travel time is down, but in many cases it's down 15 to 20%, despite growing congestion. And ridership is up tremendously. After only a few years, the combination of the branding, the reliability, and the faster travel time has grown ridership over 40%, and the growth continues. So I just want to thank everybody, and it's always great to get such a good-sized group of people interested enough in transit to dedicate a significant chunk of time. And I look forward to seeing as many of you as possible in Seattle at the Designing Cities Conference in September. Thank you.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, you can.
We
Okay.
can hear you, John.
Okay, I have a new phone in my new office, and I thought the mute button was on. I was trying to turn it off, and anyway, that was a great presentation, Bill, and again, some phenomenal photos to illustrate your points. Really well done. So we're going to jump into some questions now. Some of you guys have posed questions. We've got about 333 people listening to this webinar, what we're trying to do is to figure out some of the best questions that could answer a lot of your guys' questions and concerns, because there's a lot of good content presented by Matthew and Bill. So the panelists have kind of came up with a couple questions ahead of time, so I'm going to just kind of go through those real quick, and then we're going to jump into some of the general get into the general Q&A. The first question that the panel came up with was that Seattle's explosive growth might be very difficult for stakeholders, particularly businesses that are impacted. So to understand the need for transit and support of these projects, what would you say to DOTs and transit agencies and cities that are growing much more slowly or not growing at all, or maybe even losing population? How do you design transit in lower density areas?
Yeah, and it's not only how do you design transit, but it's really how do you gain support for transit. For this Westlake Avenue project, we had tremendous support from Amazon and other large stakeholders, many other large stakeholders, ranging from Fred Hutch Cancer Research Center to other medical supporters to community groups and Vulcan. It is easier to get that support when the need is so obvious, but it's not as difficult as it might seem to get the same or a similar level of support even when the growth isn't as explosive. The process can take a little bit longer, but I think the Transit Street Design Guide and other documentation can help cities and transit agencies and partnerships make that case. Once you lay out some of the street capacity issues and the way that transit, in many cases, even in slow-growing cities, is really the only solution to accommodating growth, that I think is fundamental to gaining that support.
Great. And Matthew, did you have?
I'd chime in and say that the interesting thing is that whether you're working, and I'm really glad, Bill, that you talked about kind of that process of building support at the level of the people who currently use the corridor, work along the corridor, have businesses live along the corridor. When you look at cities that are whether they're experiencing ridership growth or sort of or continuing the earlier, more common trend of ridership decline that kind of turned around in a lot of cities just a few years ago. One of the noteworthy things is that the cities that have done the most to turn around that ridership ridership decline and to create growth are often the cities that are doing investment in transit on the street, that are dedicating space, that are collaborating in an innovative way to make their local bus service and their rapid bus service work better, that are building trunk line services, and we see that certainly not just in the most rapidly growing cities like Seattle and Austin, but also in cities where it's really more about attracting folks to downtown and to the neighborhoods near downtowns, and then at an even deeper level in creating the kind of conditions on corridors where maybe there hasn't been a lot of recent growth, but there is expected planned new growth. And the truth is that that's something that is very common throughout the United States. You leave downtowns, with the exception of, I think really with the exception of some of the bigger, older cities, as you leave the downtown core, you're often very quickly in a place where the larger streets were designed for cars, and really where transit was an afterthought. But you look at those streets and there's already a lot of people using buses on those streets. And so those are really interesting places to be doing investment in better service and in better street design.
Absolutely. I'd like to just really quickly add that Seattle's been building these projects through up and down economic cycles, through periods of ridership decline. 2 of the 3 BRT lines that run in Seattle were built during the economic downturn of, kind of following 2008, 2009, 2010. So they're just kind of a different set of arguments. And at those low points when traffic is light, it's actually sometimes easier to add some of these priority measures.
It's a great point. Well, then let's think of the other side of that coin, where in many suburbs of like Sunbelt cities that have large arterial streets with very high levels of traffic, and they have a need to expand multimodal options, say for BRT or bike lanes, there's often a fear of public backlash to reallocating street space when congestion is already very high. Are there good examples for suburban arterial street conversions in low to medium density suburbs that can feed commercial centers?
Matthew, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think there are actually... Sure. Yeah, I think there are a number of good examples. I might not call them suburban, but certainly in cities with a lower density or a lower overall population, there have been some great examples of creating higher quality transit and attracting ridership. One example is San Bernardino near Los Angeles, which built its first BRT line. Actually used they use buses that have left side doors and right side doors. Sometimes they run on the right side of a street and sometimes in the center of the street in dedicated lanes. And what's noteworthy about that is that they're really looking toward growth. They're looking toward expanding their transit network, and they see that kind of investment is really both in dollar terms, but maybe more significantly in space terms. BRT is much more cost-effective than a lot of other kinds of transit investment. Still needs that space, right? So I think they see that investment as really a stepping stone to almost a more urban future. And I think that's true for a lot of cities. And the remarkable thing is that all around the NACTO network, whether we're talking about cities that have very high downtown ridership and a need to get things moving more quickly in a oversubscribed kind of downtown street, or whether we're looking at those kind of more major corridor, John, what you mentioned, the kind of classic suburban arterial. A lot of those quote suburban arterials are actually in cities. and even those that are not are often in a fairly dense place where the fundamental conditions for transit ridership are already there, and where moreover there's often a neighborhood interest and demand and a local interest and demand in creating more compact growth. And then the flip side of that, and there are some other really good examples of converting that kind of highway environment, the kind of almost surface highway environment into a street. And I think the Metroway project in the sections where it runs through Alexandria is a great example. Certainly a city, but that environment had been very highway-like before. But what's interesting is that kind of growth, I think we're seeing that more and more places, cities, towns, and cities that might think of themselves as towns are really now starting to see that they can't have the kind of growth that they want if they only put if they put all of their street space into car traffic. And they really are starting to also see that even for people who don't have any near-term intention of switching to transit, they often see the benefits increasingly of having that kind of efficient, dedicated space, of having the option of always being able to take transit. So there's an interesting thing that I think is happening across the country that's a change. We're really at an inflection point where people are starting to take transit investments and transit service and transit streets more seriously, not just in places that have a lot of it, but in places that only have a little now and that really see it as a stepping stone, again, to a more urban future.
Okay, thank you. Next question is that looking at how bicycles and BRTs could share the same lane or corridor, a lot of BRT projects are being planned without accommodating bicyclists, and we're starting to see more bicycle advocates pushing back, saying bikes need to be a part of the corridor and possibly share the lane. So how do you guys see this situation unfolding, and are there examples where bikes have been successfully integrated into BRT lanes?
Well, I can go first on this one. It's a very, there's so many different sets of conditions that it's the opposite of one size fits all. One of the approaches that we've taken in Seattle is to combine bike facility design with the BRT project, but recognize that the bike facility may or may not be on the main corridor. And that's been necessary in a couple cases where there simply is not the lane width, particularly where there are any hills and bikes are moving slowly. If you have less than 14, 15 feet of width, bicycles are just not going to mix well with the transit traffic. So there's a range of solutions. The best of all worlds is when you can do something like some of the photos that both Matthew and I showed of protected bike lanes integrated with the transit facilities. That's not always possible.
Good answer, Bill. I think you're absolutely right. The range of conditions is immense, and it's all about really understanding. I think understanding the needs of both bus operations and of bike operations. They're two very different things, and I think unfortunately, I think in the past there had been a tendency to kind of say, all right, well, here are a couple of things that operate on the right side of the street. So let's give them the right lane and then add in some right turns, and then that's it. And certainly at lower speeds, that can still work. And the NACTO Transit Street Design Guide does support at low speeds the use of shared bus bike lanes, and recommends that be in places where it's not a critical part of the bike network. It's not a high comfort bike facility, certainly. That's not going to attract all ages and abilities of bicyclists, but often you need to provide access. And I'd almost flip it around and say there are a lot of streets where where there's a necessity for bus lanes, especially looking at kind of smaller two-way streets. There might be a need for bus lanes, and the only really good place to be on a bike is in that lane, and so at least permitting, allowing bikes to use it, and then designing for it, meaning usually designing relatively narrow lanes so that buses aren't tempted to pass the bike, and then at stops having more room so that when possible, so that so the bikes can bypass that stopped bus instead of trying to sneak to the right of it. And I think there's a lot of solutions, but really, I think, Bill, you pointed to two of the best ones, which is having a high quality, high comfort bike facility, usually a protected bike lane on the same street or on a close parallel street, are really good ways to do it.
Yeah, and we, in Seattle, we almost, I think all of our bus lanes, virtually all of our bus lanes do allow bikes, because you don't want to try to steer bikes into the inside lane, for example, into the general purpose lane. It's just, in many cases, it's just not safe. Bikes generally are treated here in Seattle as having the right to be in the curb lane. And Matthew, I totally agree that there are many, many street profiles and situations where shared lanes can and do work really well.
Great. Well, let's see. We have some more questions here. I think some users have submitted, or listeners have submitted questions. And this one question that I want to ask is there a speed-based design standard to get natural compliance with a target speed? So, for example, if a target speed is 25 miles per hour, are there geometric designs that will get natural compliance with that speed? And if not, is such a standard practical?
Absolutely, there are, and the Urban Street Design Guide, that's that green one I showed at the beginning of my presentation, is in large part devoted to explaining how to achieve that kind of a street, the street that supports safe speeds for all users, that supports high comfort environments for all users. So that's a great question, and one of the interesting things about transit street design is that when you start to look at a lot of the, especially a lot of the larger streets, whether it's big one-way downtown streets or whether it's the kind of big two-way quote arterial close quote corridors that have encouraged higher speeds historically, one of the ways to make those streets work better is to not have the kind of hurry up and wait pattern where you've got lots and lots of roadway width devoted to single occupancy vehicles, but then there's still red signals they're going to run up to and wait at, and so there's that speeding up to reach that red light, hurry up and wait. That's a dangerous pattern for everybody. Dedicating a transit lane and organizing that street has been shown in city after city to support consistent travel speeds for cars, meaning that there's no change in the amount of time that it takes to get from point A to point B for cars, while actually encouraging lower top speeds, that is, reducing speeding. So a number of the examples from New York, I believe a number of the examples from San Francisco have yielded those results.
Well, we're getting, technically, I think our time is over, but I just want to end this with one quick, well, it's a quick question. It could be a long answer, but let's try and maybe see if we can answer it, in just a few sentences. What is the best way to get street departments to even consider letting buses stop in lane?
Oh, let me see if I can answer that in sentences. The best way, I'd say it's two-pronged. One is just documenting the time that it takes for buses to re-enter traffic. In some cases, during peak periods, delays can be, 30 seconds a stop or something like that. And putting that delay in perspective based on the person delay, based on the number of people on the bus, and illustrating the number of cars that are likely to be delayed and the occupancy of those cars, I think you can often make a compelling case. I would encourage other cities to sort of, and at SDOT, and I know NACTO, we're very eager to help other cities do this, kind of build a case based on what other cities like Seattle are doing. And then just last, I'd say historically, in-lane stops have been standard in many ways on old streetcar lines. In various areas, in-lane stops have been in place for decades, and people just don't notice because that's the way it's been.
Well,
that's
thank you
absolutely
so
right.
much.
And I would just add, if you're having trouble in the middle of the agency, go to the top. And I'd add that a lot of the largest, busiest, fastest streets, sometimes without parking, already have buses stopping on the curb, and that's you can start to say, okay, look, it's safe here. So safety isn't a concern. It's really about operations. You can actually make things better in a lot of cases for car travel, or hold it constant because buses aren't pulling halfway out of traffic.
Absolutely, very good point. There are many issues where just having that bus clearly stay in the lane creates a better situation for everybody.
Well, perfect. Thank you so much,
question,
Matthew. Yeah, thank you so much to both of you. And also, thank you so much to Shalita for making your big announcement and for welcoming us. And I'd like to pass this back over to Matt Solomon from Island Press to close this out.
Yeah, thank you very much, Sean. And thanks, everyone, for a really great discussion. I think we covered a lot of ground. We had great questions from the audience. We had a lot of them, too, and I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. So, who knows, maybe we'll have to do a part 2 or something. So anyway, I'll take this opportunity to wrap things up. I do, again, want to thank all of our sponsors, our great speakers, Matthew Rowe and Bill Bryant, and our moderator, of course, John Renne. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in. We had a really great turnout, and we really appreciate it. I'd like to ask if you could just take a minute or two to take the exit survey. There are only a few questions. And of course, be sure to pick up the NACTO Transit Street Design Guide for 20% off with the promo code 2NACTO at islandpress.org. And again, thank you very much, everyone. And this is Matt from Island Press, and hope to see you all soon. Take care. Bye.